Okay, so there's one final section of manipulation from Stanley that's really uncomfortable, actually, sort of cringe-worthy, uncomfortable manipulation that I think feeds into this sort of Oedipal reading of their relationship and that prepares us, perhaps unawares at this point in time, but prepares us by way of kind of proleptic irony for the subconscious breakdown, or the expression of the subconscious, is a conscious breakdown and expression of the subconscious that occurs during the peak climax during the interrogation, where Stanley's found kind of sexually assaulting women. Now, Meg asks, was it nice? And she's talking about the fried bread, obviously. We haven't left far. And Stanley uses the word succulent. And there's this very odd wordplay over I guess, the sexual connotations of this word. You shouldn't say that word. What word? That word you said. Now, I think what we're also getting here is perhaps Stanley's, an ironic vision of Stanley's intellect, and also, I think, possibly a moment where we see in prototypical form his sort of rebellious status. He really doesn't like being told what to do, and that's the final line of the play. Pete says, "Don't let them tell you what to do, Stan." And Pinter has famously kind of taken this to be a sort of personal mantra, and has found later on in his career, when he looks back at A Birthday Party, which was really his sort of first major theatrical work, that actually that resistance to being ordered around is an important quality, and I think there's an element of this involved in this dialogue. But the word succulent obviously slips in its signification. You know, this is, without wanting to go down the postmodern critical discourse route that we briefly looked at last year when we were studying post-structuralism. This word, I think, changes its signification throughout this dialogic chain, throughout this series of interactions, where it begins, you know, as an adjective for describing the texture of a piece of food, but then Meg changes its connotation accidentally, so that the sort of sexual subtext of this dialogue becomes a little bit more nakedly obvious. Stanley keeps repeating it. What's succulent? Don't say it. What's the matter with it? You shouldn't say that word to a married woman. Is that a fact? Yes. Well, I never knew that. Well, it's true. Who told you that? Never you mind. Well, if I can't say it to a married woman, who can I say it to? You're bad. There's a number of things going on here. I think Stanley is, first of all, posing in the role of Meg's tormentor here. You know, he adopts a sort of tormenting, interrogative role that I think, again, anticipates his own treatment when Goldberg and McCann arrive. I think there's an Oedipal element to this particular dialogue as well that is made relatively transparent, I think. But actually what also is going on is a commentary on the flawed nature of language and on its enigmatic qualities, the way in which it can communicate in a faulty way to a number of different people. You know, Stanley is absolutely not, I think, using that word initially in a sexual way or as a sort of taboo sort of social norm violation. But at this moment in time, that's the way that Meg's interpreted it. And I think that Stanley's resistance to that tells us something of his character, his sort of rebellious character. Something about his cruel intent to toy with Meg's feelings and perhaps her outmoded social orthodoxies, we don't know. But also about the unreliability of language in general. You know, that there's something tortuous actually about language's inarticulacy, about its ability to create gaps and blockages and absences and lacunae and hiatuses between individuals. You know, that there's a distance between Stanley and Meg here at the level of communication because of the slipperiness of that word. Perhaps slipperiness is another word that we shouldn't say. He changes the subject and says, you know, what about some tea? Do you want some tea? Stanley reads the paper. Say please. Again, there's this childlike absurdity in his power over her that is ironically depicted here because Meg seems to be bossing him around, say please, developing this sort of Oedipal theme with orders like this that are explicitly infantilizing. And Stanley responds with please, and then she says, say sorry first. And then Stanley does the classic infantile, toddler boy thing of repeating what she's saying. Say sorry first, and then he says sorry first, and then over the page, no, just sorry, you deserve the strap, don't do that. And Stanley, depending on the way this is played, you could take that to be a kind of early moment of his, incipient resistance to violence. But it could equally be read as just a continuation of this kind of playful tormenting of her. But really, the irony here is that he inverts the roles where he has all the power and she is performing the guise, the sort of veneer of parental authority. And again, the language that's used to create that exposes exactly the opposite of what it appears to mean on the page when we don't know anything about the character. So again, language is highly unreliable in these dialogues. After this sort of tormenting, she takes his plate and ruffles his hair as she passes, and Stanley exclaims and throws her arm away. And there is a very clear, I think, picture of her unconditional love for him in that stage direction, and his quite dismissive treatment of Meg. He's very cold, I would think it would be a way to describe him. And again, that's part of this overall audience positioning and distancing, preventing us from empathising with his protagonist before he's subjected to a fate and a series of events where we do, I think, empathise with him because we see ourselves in perhaps his destiny. A little further down, we'll take a bit of a jump here. Stanley shifts the dialogue and shifts into momentarily a more kind of comfortable, flattering mode of engagement with her, where he says, I don't know what I'd do without you, but it's fake. It's fake, and we can see that through the sudden shift that occurs underneath, where he criticises her tea, and we know that that's a sensitive subject, particularly to all English people, actually. I should make that very clear. It's not nice to have your tea-making skills criticised. And Stanley says, get out of it, you succulent old washing bag. So there's a sort of tension, there's a definite linguistic tension in his insult of her. That he's using that word deliberately because he knows it bothers her. But on a logical level, on a communicative level, that language doesn't make sense. You can't really be a succulent old washing bag, because the word succulent, if we're taking it in this sort of taboo, sexually offensive way that Meg appears to, has the connotation of health and vitality. But an old washing bag obviously means the opposite. It's something that's had its vital essence drained from it and is tired and old. And Meg responds here, I am not, and it isn't your place to tell me if I am. And it isn't your place to come into a man's bedroom and wake him up. Now, what I would say here is that this is a rare moment where Stanley, in this opening scene, appears to be kind of reasonable, actually. It isn't normal for her to come into a grown man's bedroom and wake him up, even though he is obviously being a bit lazy and sleeping all day. And Meg is equally right that it isn't his place to insult her in this fashion, and he's stepping over a boundary by using that vocabulary and by insulting her at the same time. Both of them, therefore, violate norms for social behaviour. There's a violation of social norms and the relationships and the way that they guide relationships. That both of them carry out here. So there's a taboo element to the way that they interact, and I think we see that most definitely in the opening of Streetcar, where we could look at Blanche and Stella's interactions as a violation of the normal familial social norms that govern the way that family members ought to behave. But certainly the way in which Stanley and Blanche end the scene, there's a real tense, threatening of the violation of social norms. I mean, there is, I think arguably you could say Stanley's stripping off in front of Blanche is a violation of social norms, but equally so, I guess, with Blanche's sort of invasion of their private space being their stealing of his whiskey. It does, however, it's about accumulating tension in that opening Williams scene that really, it's the threat of the violation of social norms. Whereas we can already tell here that the relationships between these two characters are very clearly based on the violation of social norms. There's a real unorthodox quality to the way that they interact with each other, and they both sort of seem to be getting something personally out of this, even though that it actually involves them being both quite irritating to each other. There's a bizarre suggestion there about the way in which we go about establishing intimacy with people, and the way in which our own self-alienation and our alienation from others leads us down quite bizarre paths in order to compensate for that absence of intimacy with people. These are lonely people that are forced into these bizarre relationships that violate social norms because the nature of relationships themselves is alienating. A little further, Meg says, "That's good strong tea, that's all," and Stanley's been criticising a cup of tea. He's really gone for it. And he simply puts his head in his hands and says, "Oh God, I'm tired." And he's tormented here, and I think this is where we start to see that this torturous behaviour that he imposes on Meg is really nothing more than a problem of being bored and of feeling constrained and feeling limited and unhappy. He's deeply saddened by this interaction with Meg and its banality. It's totally banal and repetitive. And her insistence on the simplistic nature of this dialogue, I think, leads to this sense of despair. And I think we could see the internal conflict that is the subtext of this gesture, this stage direction, putting his head in his hands. There's this sense of alienation and despair that he is decidedly unhappy with social orthodoxy and living in a normal way, but his retreat away from convention and from society into this bizarre, insular environment that he finds himself in with Meg and PT is also extremely alienating. So he becomes trapped in what you would call an existential impasse. He cannot relate fully to society and the social orthodoxies that govern it, but equally in this insufferable kind of insular, suffocating atmosphere of banality, he's also unfulfilled. So the conflict is established in that stage direction, I think, between his competing desires for, I think, liberty and freedom away from social orthodoxy, but also then of empathy and of mutual understanding with humans. And it appears to be that Pinto is suggesting to us that we can't really have both. It's impossible really to have complete freedom from social orthodoxy in society and to also have a mutual understanding with people, because after all, that is the sort of fabric, the human fabric of society, is mutual understanding and reciprocation. There's silence, which always tells us that there's, again, some dramatic subtext, which is fairly clear, that it required that amount of explanation and explication in those lines to explain what is going on and how that is a precipitating moment of internal conflict for Stanley. Meg realises, I think, that this is perhaps a serious moment of despair and moves. She obviously wouldn't be in the position to analyse it and articulate it, but she realises he's unhappy. And Meg goes to the sideboard, collects a duster and vaguely dusts the room watching him. She comes to the table and dusts it, and then he says, "Not the bloody table!" And there's another pause. So there's real tension in this stage business here, this mundane behaviour that Meg goes about doing. It's that ritual. She wants something familiar. She knows he's unhappy. She does absolutely no idea how to deal with it or what's caused it or how to go about processing it with him. So she goes about another ritual. The dusting the furniture is the equivalent of the language and the dialogue that she uses. It's rituals that are designed to cover the gaping void that's at the heart of her existence, that there is no understanding, there is no mutual feeling. So this habit is just a simple ritual that is designed to overcome that sense of absence. And that's why I think that's particularly evident in the fact that she vaguely dusts the room. She's not really doing it because she's trying to dust the room. She doesn't really know what else to do to overcome the sense of awkwardness. And Stanley shouts, and that tension is huge at that moment in time, the tension between the two of them. His frustration with her intellectual limitations and her inability to understand other people, and her frustration with him for being so hostile when all she attempts to do for him is to be positive and to provide him with care and concern. I think we could, at that moment in time, possibly compare that with Blanche and Stanley's dialogue towards the end of the first scene in Streetcar. We have this enormous sense of tension in terms of their intentions and their motives. It's evident when Stanley says, I fear you won't find me the kind of refined type, and their worldviews are so gently suggested by those culminating actions in the scene.